The artifact sat in the center of the containment field like a bad joke waiting for a punchline. I should mention that my name is Vex, and I work as a senior containment specialist for the Galactic Archaeological Survey. 23 cycles of examining dead civilizations, cataloging their failures, and trying not to get killed by whatever automated defenses they left behind. You would think I had seen everything by now. You would be wrong. The weapon, if that is what it actually was, measured roughly 2 meters in length. It resembled a hammer, though calling it a hammer felt like calling a supernova a light show. The head was forged from some dense metallic compound that our scanners could not identify, wrapped in geometric patterns that hurt to look at for too long. The handle appeared to be made from a similar unknown material, dark and somehow hungry looking. "How much does it weigh?" asked Krell, my assistant. He was young, barely 5 cycles out of the academy, with the kind of optimism that made me tired just looking at him. "According to the sensors, approximately 4,000 kilograms, I replied, checking my datapad for the 17th time that hour. Krell whistled, which for his species involved 3 separate breathing orifices and sounded deeply unpleasant. "That is impossible. Nothing that size should weigh that much, unless it is compressed neutronium, and if it were neutronium we would all be dead already." "Congratulations on your basic understanding of physics," I said. "Gold star for you." He ignored my sarcasm, which was probably wise. "Have we tried moving it yet?" "Of course we have tried moving it. We are not complete idiots." I gestured toward the containment field where 6 different mechanical arms lay scattered around the artifact, each one bent or snapped at impossible angles. The gravity clamps failed, the molecular lifters failed, even the Threskin power harness failed, and that thing can lift a small moon. So what now? Now we wait for the human. Krell's anterior eyes widened. "You requested a human. Are you insane?" "Possibly," I admitted, "but Director Malthus thinks they might be useful, and I am not about to argue with someone who has 4 times my security clearance and twice my paranoia." The truth was that humans had been making waves across the galactic community for the past decade. They showed up out of nowhere, climbing out of their little corner of space with their fragile bodies and their ridiculous confidence, and then proceeded to solve problems that had stumped the rest of us for centuries. It was infuriating. They were strong, absurdly so, which made no sense given their size and structure. They healed from injuries that would kill most species. They ate toxins for recreation, and called it spicy food. And most disturbing of all, they had this uncanny ability to interface with ancient technology that should have been incompatible with their biology. Hence why we called one. The human arrived 3 hours later, and I knew immediately that my day was about to get worse. She was tall for her species, maybe 1.8 meters, with skin the color of burnished copper and hair pulled back in what humans called a ponytail. She wore a standard-issue survey uniform that somehow looked both professional and vaguely threatening on her frame. Her identification tag read, Lieutenant Morgan Reeves. "So," she said, walking into the containment bay without so much as a greeting, "you have a hammer you cannot lift. We have an artifact of unknown origin that our equipment cannot manipulate," I corrected. "Please try to use proper terminology." She grinned at me, showing far too many teeth. "Humans did that when they found something amusing, and it always looked predatory." "Sure, the hammer you cannot lift." Krell stepped forward, his translator chip struggling to keep up with his nervous chittering. "Lieutenant Reeves, we are grateful for your assistance. The artifact has proven resistant to all conventional methods of transport. We were hoping your species might have some insight." "My insight is that you probably tried to outsmart it," Morgan said, already walking toward the containment field. "How many times did your scanners analyze it?" "Approximately 463 complete scans," I said. "Right. And how many times did you just try picking it up?" There was a pause. "The mass calculations indicated that manual manipulation would be impossible," I said carefully. "Uh-huh." Morgan was now standing at the edge of the containment field, hands on her hips, staring at the weapon with the kind of focus that made me uncomfortable. "Can you drop the field?" "Absolutely not," I said. "Protocol requires that unknown artifacts remain contained until..." Until what? Until you scan it another 500 times, and still learn nothing. She turned to look at me, and I was reminded uncomfortably that humans were persistence hunters back on their homeworld. Drop the field. I will sign whatever waiver you want. I looked at Krell. He looked back at me. We both knew this was a terrible idea. I dropped the field. Morgan walked up to the weapon without hesitation, which was either brave or stupid, and with humans it was often impossible to tell the difference. She circled it once, then twice, her eyes tracking across every detail of its construction. Interesting, she muttered. What is interesting? I demanded. These markings. They are not decorative. Obviously, we determined they were likely some form of inscription or warning system. No, Morgan said, crouching down next to the hammer. They are instructions. That stopped me cold. Instructions for what? For how to lift it. She reached out and touched the handle, and I swear every monitoring device in the room spiked simultaneously. This is not a weapon that cannot be moved. It is a weapon that will not be moved. Big difference. That makes no sense, Krell said. Sure it does. It is a test. Morgan stood up, brushing off her hands. The civilization that made this did not want just anyone picking it up. So they built in a requirement. You have to be worthy. Worthy how? I asked, feeling my patience wearing thin. I have no idea, but I am about to find out. Before I could stop her, Morgan grabbed the handle with both hands. Nothing happened. I mean, literally nothing. The weapon did not move. Morgan did not fly backward. The containment bay did not explode. There was just a human standing there holding onto an immovable object, looking mildly annoyed. Huh, she said. Are you all right? Krell asked, already moving toward the emergency medkit. I am fine. It is just. Morgan adjusted her grip, her muscles flexing under her uniform. Give me a second. What happened next would haunt my dreams for cycles. Morgan lifted the weapon. Not easily, not smoothly. She strained, her face contorting with effort, her boots scraping against the floor as she fought for leverage. But slowly, impossibly, the hammer rose off its mounting platform. Blessed ancients, Krell whispered. Morgan held the weapon at chest height for maybe 3 seconds before lowering it back down with a heavy thud that shook the entire bay. She stepped back, breathing hard, and rolled her shoulders like she had just finished a workout. 4,000 kilograms? She asked. Approximately, I said, my voice coming out higher than I intended. Huh? Morgan looked at the weapon again, tilting her head. Feels more like 3,000, still unbalanced though. There was a moment of absolute silence. What? I finally managed. The weight distribution is off, Morgan explained, gesturing at the hammer like we were discussing furniture placement. The head is too heavy relative to the handle, and there is something weird about the center of gravity. Someone designed this thing, but they did not design it well. It is usable, but it would be a pain in a real fight. I stared at her. Krell stared at her. Our monitoring equipment continued to throw up error messages across every screen. You just lifted 4,000 kilograms, I said slowly. And your primary concern is that it feels unbalanced. Well, yeah. What good is a weapon you cannot use properly? She flexed her fingers, looking thoughtful. Although I have to admit, once I got it moving it was not as bad as I expected. Whatever material this is made from, it responds to kinetic input in weird ways. Almost like it wants to be used. Wants to be used, I repeated. Sure, you know, smart matter, adaptive weighting, that kind of thing. We have been experimenting with similar concepts back home, but nothing this sophisticated. Morgan walked around the hammer again. This is really impressive work. Whoever made this understood physics on a level we are still catching up to. Krell had his datapad out, frantically taking notes. Lieutenant, do you have any idea how you were able to lift it when our equipment failed? Not really. Maybe it is a biological thing, or maybe, she paused, frowning, maybe it just needed someone stubborn enough to ignore the rules telling them it was impossible. That was the moment I realized we had made a terrible mistake calling the humans. Not because they were dangerous, though they absolutely were. Not because they were unpredictable, though that was certainly true. but because they looked at the universe and all its carefully established limitations, and their first instinct was to completely ignore them. "We need to run tests," I said, trying to reassemble some semblance of authority over this situation. "Extensive tests, medical scans, gravitational analysis, biochemical workups." Morgan was still staring at the hammer with the expression humans got when they found something particularly fascinating. "Sure, yeah. But first I want to try something." "No," I said immediately. "Absolutely not. Whatever you are thinking, the answer is no." She picked up the hammer again. This time it looked easier. Not easy, mind you. Her arms still shook with effort, and I could see the strain in her posture. But she lifted it to shoulder height and held it there, steady, like she was getting used to the weight. "Lieutenant Reeves, put down the artifact," I said, my voice climbing into what Krell later described as my panicked register. In a second, Morgan took a step forward, then another, carrying the hammer across the containment bay. "I want to see how it handles in motion." "This is not a gymnasium," I practically shrieked. "That is an artifact of immeasurable historical significance from a dead civilization, not a piece of exercise equipment." "Relax, Vex, I am being careful." She was not being careful. She was swinging the hammer in slow arcs, testing its momentum, making small adjustments to her grip. Every movement made our sensors scream with fresh warnings about mass displacement and localized gravitational anomalies. "Okay, this is definitely not balanced correctly," Morgan said, lowering the hammer again. "But I think I can work with it. The weight shifts depending on how you move it. See if you compensate for the offset by..." She demonstrated with another swing, and I watched in horror as the hammerhead traced a path through the air that looked completely wrong according to every law of physics I understood. "Stop," commanded a new voice from the doorway. We all turned to see Director Malthus standing at the entrance, his three eyes fixed on Morgan with an expression I could not quite read. Behind him stood two security officers, their weapons conspicuously visible. "Director," I said, grateful for the intervention. I was just about to secure the artifact and begin proper documentation procedures. "No," Malthus said, walking into the bay. "You were about to make history, and you did not even realize it." That was not what I expected him to say. Malthus approached Morgan slowly, his gaze never leaving the hammer. "Lieutenant Reeves, I presume." "That is right," Morgan said, lowering the weapon but not releasing it. I noticed her posture had shifted slightly, more guarded now. "Do you know what that is?" Malthus asked. "A poorly balanced hammer made by people with more ambition than sense." The director made a sound that might have been a laugh. "That hammer, Lieutenant, has been responsible for 3 separate wars over the past 1,000 cycles. 6 expeditions tried to claim it. All of them failed. 42 beings died attempting to move it from this chamber, and you just picked it up and complained about its ergonomics." Morgan shrugged. "I call them like I see them." "Of course you do." Malthus turned to me. "Vex, do you know the legend of the Warden's hammer?" "I know there are stories," I said carefully. "Myths about a weapon left behind by the precursors. Supposedly it could only be wielded by someone pure of heart or some similar nonsense." "Not pure of heart," Malthus corrected. "Strong of will. The precursors did not care about morality. They cared about determination, stubbornness, the absolute refusal to accept limitation." He looked back at Morgan. "They built this weapon for someone who would look at 4,000 kilograms of impossibility and simply refuse to acknowledge the problem." "So it is a test," Morgan said. "Everything the precursors made was a test. This entire facility is a test. And congratulations, Lieutenant, you passed." Krell finally found his voice again. "What happens now?" "Now?" Malthus smiled, which on his species looked disturbingly similar to a human expression. "Now we find out what else Lieutenant Reeves can do." The next hour was a blur of activity. Malthus called in a full research team including several specialists I recognized from the most classified projects in the survey. They set up monitoring equipment around Morgan while she continued to experiment with the hammer, testing its capabilities. And what capabilities they turned out to be. The hammer was not just heavy, it was smart. Morgan discovered that when she swung it with intent, the weapon amplified the force of her strike exponentially. A gentle tap against a test block produced a shockwave that cracked the reinforced material. A full swing would have probably destroyed the entire bay if Malthus had not stopped her in time. "This is a weapon designed to fight on a completely different scale," one of the researchers said, reviewing the data. "The force multiplication alone would make it effective against targets the size of spacecraft. Or bigger," Malthus added quietly. Morgan was sitting on a cargo container now, the hammer resting across her knees. She looked tired but exhilarated. So what was it for? What were the precursors fighting that needed something like this? "We do not know," Malthus admitted. "The precursors disappeared roughly 50,000 cycles ago. Whatever they were preparing for either never came, or came and destroyed them, despite weapons like this." "Comforting thought," Morgan said dryly. "Indeed." The director moved closer, his expression serious. "Lieutenant, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. When you hold that hammer, what do you feel?" Morgan was quiet for a moment, her hand resting on the weapon's handle. "Power," she said finally. "Like I could move mountains if I wanted to. But also," she paused, searching for words, "also responsibility. Like this thing is judging me, making sure I am worthy of what it can do." "And are you?" Malthus asked. "Worthy? Hell if I know," Morgan said with a slight smile. "But I am stubborn enough to try." That was when the alarms started. Red emergency lights flooded the bay, and every monitoring station began shrieking warnings simultaneously. I pulled up the security feed and felt my respiratory system seize. "Director, we have incoming vessels," one of the security officers reported. "Multiple signatures, all armed. They are broadcasting on Kralgath frequencies." Malthus cursed in 3 languages. "How did they find us?" "Does it matter?" I snapped. "The Kralgath Collective has been searching for precursor weapons for decades. If they know we found the hammer, they will kill everyone here to claim it. The Kralgath were not a species you wanted to meet under any circumstances. They were conquerors, plain and simple, massive, heavily armored, and utterly convinced of their right to rule the galaxy through superior firepower. They had been laying claim to precursor sites for years, often through violent means. "How long until they reach us?" Malthus demanded. 15 minutes, the security officer said. "Maybe 20 if we are lucky." "We need to evacuate," Krell said, already backing toward the door. "We cannot defend this facility against a Kralgath assault force." "We cannot let them have the hammer either," Malthus countered. "If the Kralgath get their hands on a precursor weapon, they will use it to expand their territory. Millions will die." Everyone looked at Morgan. She stood up slowly, lifting the hammer with that same strained but determined motion. "So we do not let them have it." "Lieutenant, you are not seriously suggesting we fight," I said. "You are one human with a weapon you barely understand against an entire Kralgath war party. You got a better idea?" I did not. Which was the problem. Malthus made a decision. Everyone except essential security personnel evacuates immediately. Vex, Krell, get to the ships. Lieutenant Reeves, if you are staying, I am staying with you. "Director, that is suicide," one of the researchers protested. "Then I will die protecting something that matters," Malthus said calmly. "Now go." The evacuation was chaos. Researchers scrambled for the shuttle bays while security teams set up defensive positions that we all knew would not hold for long. Krell grabbed my arm, trying to pull me toward the exit, but I shook him off. "I am staying," I said. "Vex, you are a containment specialist, not a soldier." "Exactly. If anyone understands how to use this facility's defenses, it is me." I pulled up my data pad, accessing the building's security systems. "Besides, someone needs to document what happens next, for the historical record." Krell stared at me like I had grown a second head. Then he sighed. "You are an idiot." "Probably. Now go." He went. Morgan was standing at the main entrance now, the hammer resting on her shoulder. Malthus stood beside her, armed with a standard plasma rifle that looked woefully inadequate for what was coming. "So," Morgan said, conversationally, "any advice for fighting Kralgath?" "Yes," Malthus said. "Do not get hit. They are incredibly strong, heavily armored, and completely ruthless." "Got it?" Do not get hit by the scary space warriors. Any other wisdom? Try to survive. I was planning on that anyway. The first Kralgath warriors breached the outer defenses 7 minutes later. They came through the main entrance like a tidal wave of armored fury. Each one stood nearly 3 meters tall, covered in thick carapace plating that could deflect most conventional weapons. They carried weapons that looked like they could punch holes through starship hulls. Morgan stepped forward to meet them. The lead Kralgath warrior saw her and actually paused, probably confused about why a single human was standing between them and their objective. That pause cost him. Morgan swung the hammer. The impact was beyond description. The force of the blow caught the Kralgath in the chest and sent him flying backward into his companions. The shockwave from the strike shattered windows and cracked the floor beneath her feet. The other Kralgath warriors stared in shock. Then they charged. What followed was not a battle, it was a demonstration. Morgan moved through the Kralgath forces like a storm given human form. Every swing of the hammer sent warriors flying. Every impact produced shockwaves that knocked others off their feet. The weapon seemed to respond to her will, its weight shifting and adjusting to maximize the force of each strike. And through it all, Morgan was laughing. "Okay," she shouted over the chaos. "I take it back. This hammer is perfectly balanced." A Kralgath commander rushed her from the side. Morgan spun, bringing the hammer around in a wide arc. The weapon connected with his armor, and I watched in amazement as the supposedly indestructible carapace simply shattered. "Vex," Malthus called out. "How many more?" I checked the security feeds. At least 30 still incoming, but the ones outside are hesitating now. They were hesitating because they could see what was happening to their companions. The Kralgath prided themselves on being unstoppable. They had conquered dozens of worlds through sheer intimidation and overwhelming force. They were not used to losing. Morgan stood in the center of the bay, breathing hard but still standing. Broken Kralgath warriors lay scattered around her. The hammer gleamed in her hands, unmarked despite the violence it had just inflicted. "Who is next?" she called out. The remaining Kralgath warriors looked at each other. Then, in a display I never thought I would witness, they retreated. The mighty Kralgath collective, terror of the outer systems, ran away from one human with a hammer. Morgan lowered the weapon and turned to us. "So, still think calling a human was a bad idea?" I had to admit, grudgingly, that perhaps it had been the right call after all. The facility was a mess. The evacuation would need to continue anyway, but the hammer was safe, and more importantly, we had survived. "Lieutenant Reeves," Malthus said formally, "on behalf of the Galactic Archaeological Survey, I thank you for your service." "No problem," Morgan said, setting the hammer down with a heavy thud, "though I have to say, you guys really need better security. And maybe some weapons that actually work against people like the Kralgath." "We will take that under advisement," I said dryly. Morgan grinned at me again, all teeth. "Hey Vex, you think there are more of these hammers lying around?" I felt something that might have been dread settle into my organs. "Why do you ask?" "Just thinking. If the precursors made one weapon like this, they probably made others, and if they are all just sitting around waiting for someone stubborn enough to pick them up," she shrugged, "seems like humanity might have a new hobby." Malthus and I exchanged glances. "We are doomed," I said. "Probably," Malthus agreed. But as I watched Morgan Reeves stand among the defeated Kralgath warriors, holding a weapon that had waited 50,000 cycles for someone worthy to wield it, I could not help but think that maybe, just maybe, the galaxy had found something it did not know it needed. Someone too stubborn to accept that some things were impossible. The precursors would have approved.